Welcome to the magical world of G. Michael Vasey podcast, where together we will explore the edges of reality. True tales of the paranormal, strange tales of magic and fairy, reality-focused poetry, and much, much more. Join me, G. Michael Vasey, in my magical world. Hello and welcome. This is the first in what I hope will be a successful series of podcasts around the nature of reality. I'll be talking to interesting guests, other authors, writers, researchers in all kinds of fields, from paranormal activity through to science and other areas, psychology, that kind of thing. I'll be looking at reading some of my stories, some of your stories, some of my poetry, playing some music, anything really to do with the nature of reality. My interest in the nature of reality started when I was very, very young. I recall being a small boy, perhaps 5, 6, 7 years of age, sitting in the front room of a small house in West Hull, Yorkshire, and thinking that really I wasn't there at all. Where I actually was in a small room down a corridor full of such small rooms, attached to a machine that allowed me to see, feel, and hear a sort of holiday reality, that my life was simply some form of virtual reality. Now think about it, this was 1965, 66, 1967, somewhere around there, and certainly at that age I had no idea what virtual reality was, but I had this strange feeling that my life was really a virtual reality. I wasn't really there, I wasn't really living it, I was experiencing something that was perhaps a holiday that I'd paid for, or simply a way to gain experience. And as I grew up, of course, I was seeing certain things like ghosts and experiencing paranormal activity. I became interested in magic, and I became interested in how you could create your own reality, how you could use meditation and prayer and visualization and other such forms of concentration of attention. And then I found quantum physics and the writings of people like Anthony Peake 10 years ago. And so today I spend most of my time thinking about reality in a very magical way and trying to connect with the landscape around me, with the nature spirits and with the goddess as I see it. And just recently I put out a book called Chasing the Shaman, which is really a follow-on to my very first book, which was called Inner Journeys, Explorations of the Soul, which talked about me growing up the way I did and interacting with the School of Magic in the UK, becoming a student, finding my own inner contact, my own daemon, if you wish, in Anthony Peake terminology, talking with that entity and finding some degree of peace and some degree of purpose in my life. I then moved to the Czech Republic and, cut a long story short, I found myself sort of stranded here and somewhat unhappy. So Chasing the Shaman is a book that kind of follows on from Inner Journeys and maps out the last 5 years or so, in which I came to connect with the Czech landscape, with the spirit of the Czech landscape, the Slavic gods and goddesses, and had a strange interaction with a local shaman. Here's an excerpt from the book which deals with me first meeting the shaman in my backyard. And so there I was one evening a few months later, trudging along in the cold of Brno with my daughter's dog. I'd left it a bit late, so it was well dark and biting cold. I currently rent a place below Spielberg Castle in Brno, and I take great delight in walking the surrounding parkland that is essentially the hill upon which the castle sits. It is crisscrossed with gravel and paved pathways that lead up and around the peak. Forested, it has a range of different flora and fauna that constantly changes through the seasons, and the pathways offer some magnificent views of the city of Brno. This evening, I was walking at the level of my street on one of the gravel paths that leads to a stairway down to Uvos, the street below mine. The path opens out into a large triangular space with seats and is surrounded by trees. A perfect place to engage in activities that should never be seen by the public. As I entered the triangular space, my eyes caught sight of a rucksack. At first, I thought someone must have left it there by mistake, and so I started towards it. As I got closer, though, I realized it was open and filled with what appeared to be stones and sticks and bones. I recoiled a bit, and that's when I saw what I thought was a skeletal figure laid down by the bag. Made of stones, sticks and bones, the skeletal figure shocked me and sent a chill down my neck. Even Rocky, my cocky and well-spoiled small Prague ratter, jumped. I looked around to see who was the author of this skeletal arrangement, but saw nothing or no one. Yet my interest was aroused. What was it? What was its purpose? I sensed that magic was afoot. I also felt like an intruder, and with respect for the practitioner, I stepped back and examined the arrangement from afar while ensuring Rocky didn't pee in the vicinity of the skeleton. At some point, my interest was overcome by a sense of fear. What was this? Had I stumbled onto something dark and nefarious? I immediately took a few small steps to protect myself, and surrounded now in my mind by some nice glowing and hopefully protective light, I pulled on the dog leash to leave. Rocky also seemed to have taken steps to protect himself and was also keen to leave, pulling me off into the pathway. It was then that I saw a dark figure jogging towards us. Where he came from I couldn't tell, but he didn't give me a feeling of wishing me well. So much so that I grasped the keys in my pocket, pushing one through my fingers just in case self-defense was required. Instead, he jogged past me as if Rocky and I were not there at all, and as he passed I heard his mumblings almost as if he were talking to himself. Being alone in the dark with a madman who was talking to himself after finding what looked like a symbolic skeleton was enough for me, and I pulled Rocky and set off apace. Despite that, as I put distance between me and the man, I started to feel the curiosity come back. What was he doing? So I took a different route to that planned, and within a couple of minutes I was passing along my street a couple of meters above his position, with a partial view through the trees. I stood in awe watching the man. He had a little drum thingy in one hand which he held close to his head while thumping a beat on it and was chanting to it. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I noted he was engaged in a little dance as well. A shaman. I'd stumbled on a shaman and was now watching something of a ritual. I wanted to watch more, but he looked up and straight at me without missing a beat or a word. Somehow, the fact he knew I was there made me feel afraid. I had no idea what he was up to. A skeleton. Was he raising the dead? Was one thought that raced through my mind. Once again I tugged on the dog leash and started for home. Once home, I immediately regretted that again fear had overwhelmed curiosity. Yet the fear was still with me. He had seen me. Might he be angry? Did he know who I was? All of these and other questions raced through my mind, and I ended up sleeping fitfully and with many dark and deep dreams. The next day I revisited the spot I'd seen the man the night before, me and Rocky together. The skeleton was gone, along with the rucksack, and I felt a surge of disappointment. But an inspection of the broader area revealed several clues. First of all, there was a large grey rock in the grass, and on it was the end of a cigar. By the rock was a burned patch of grass, and the burned remains of some flowers, stalks one end and petals the other. They were dark red roses, and these and some other flowers remained. To me, they looked as if they might have come from a cemetery. Close to that was a shiny, small black pebble. I'd kicked it accidentally as I walked there, but there could be no doubt that it had been placed in a deliberately hammered location so that it wouldn't move. I carefully returned it with my foot. Rocky and I set off on the rest of our walk. I'd lots to think about. What was he doing? Why had he burned flowers? And a host of similar questions. Another thing I noticed right away were the crows. There were tens, if not hundreds, of crows around the spot. I'd never seen so many of these big black birds around the castle. The crows remained through the following weeks. For several days I had the strange feeling that I'd stumbled on something best not seen. But what had I actually seen? So the end result of exploring the land and looking for magic in the Czech Republic was a much deeper connection with myself and a much deeper connection with what I can only term to be the nature spirit itself, the goddess as I call it. And I ended up writing this little poem that I'll share with you now. It's called The Kiss of Death. Deeper into nature, deeper into me. Deeper into the forest, deeper. Darker it grows and quieter. In the depths of the goddess, I am truly free. As I walk the pathway, I catch a glimpse, the woman of my dreams. She laughs and dances under a sunbeam. I know I am to follow. Deeper and deeper we go, darker, and so the dancers dance until we reach the river of life. And the woman asked me then, would I like a wife? I take her hand and we cross. The lady grinning soul pulls me closer, an embrace for eternity and the kiss of death. She takes my last breath within her sweet kiss. Time breaks down and stills, eternally kissed by the goddess, hanging in the stillness of all. Although my experiences in the Czech Republic have helped me come to terms with living in a foreign country, and now I really enjoy being here and spend my weekends seeking out earth energies and special historical places. It's actually nothing new. I did 6 weeks on an island off the west coast of Scotland as a young geology student, doing some geological mapping, and I included this story in My Haunted Life, one of my earlier books. It's called The Sword in the Water. So the island of Eigg is a small island south of the Isle of Skye in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland. It was the place I chose to go and spend 6 weeks doing geological mapping for my undergraduate thesis. I had written to the Laird seeking permission and had been duly granted that permission along with instructions on where I could camp. The island of Eigg at that time had about 50 inhabitants living on it, either permanently or just for the summer work for the estate. Most of these people lived in the southern part of the island, however, and most of my work would take place in the northern portion, where the geology was more varied and interesting. My father had built a large box with wheels at the back and a pulling handle at the front. In it, I packed 2 tents, camping gear, tinned and packet food, and everything else I thought might be needed. The box was shipped in advance so as to arrive before me. I followed the box a week or so later, taking the train first to Glasgow and along the Harry Potter route from Glasgow to Mallaig. Once in Mallaig, I took the ferry to Eigg with my box and other possessions. Needless to say, the trip from Glasgow to Mallaig is magnificent. There's lots of beautiful scenery to view almost the entire trip. On arrival, I was rather surprised to discover that my box was on the same train, and I realised just how fortunate I was. Had it arrived a day later, what on earth would I have done? The box and I moved to the ferry that was a smallish boat, with about 20 or so other people aboard. Approaching Eigg, I thought that the island resembled a huge tanker at sea. The rock formations of lava plateaus and the huge Sker of Eigg at one end gave it a very interesting profile. On arrival, I knew I would pull that box a few miles across the island. I hadn't anticipated how heavy the box was as I pulled it up the winding hill, sweating and cursing as I did so. A few cars passed me by, but no one offered to help. At the top, I rested a while and then began again, pulling the box a couple of miles and then down the other side of the island into a bay where I would camp. I hadn't seen a soul in a couple of hours by the time I arrived at the designated campsite. In fact, I didn't see anyone for a couple of days. The campsite was on the location of an old monastery, and me being me, I was a bit creeped out by it. The tent blew down the first night in a gale, and my spare tent broke a pole the very next day. I was essentially screwed. No place to stay and over 5 weeks of work to be done. I spent the remainder of the day visiting a few scattered cottages in that area, asking if anyone could put me up. and eventually found a man who had an old caravan in a field and would rent that to me for the 5 weeks. I moved in feeling pretty good. It was more comfortable and roomy than my tent, and it was quite away from the old monastery site. I started my field mapping in earnest, exploring the island, collecting samples, describing the rocks, and so on. I was totally alone in very remote locations almost all day long, every day. I honestly didn't see anyone in 3 entire weeks until I ran out of certain foods and had to walk several miles back to the other end of the island to buy provisions. Being surrounded by nature and not talking to people actually is quite pleasant after a while. You learn to keep your own company and occupy your thoughts. I found myself thinking aloud for the sake of hearing a voice at times. Nights seemed long, and being of a nervous disposition, I often slept poorly, listening to wind howling through the ropes that held down the caravan and other strange noises. From time to time, I was really frightened by a strange noise that would occur in the middle of the night. The caravan would move from side to side and vibrate while the noise occurred. I would simply lie there, terrified, with my flashlight in one hand and geological hammer in the other. From time to time, I would hear, or did I imagine, a sort of strange harmonic singing. It would rise in intensity and then fade away again. When it occurred, I would, of course, stand and try to establish where it was coming from. The sheep, about the only other living creatures around, stared back at me, munching grass, probably thinking me mad. Over a period of several days, this singing became louder and happened more often. I was convinced someone was just over the hill with the radio or something, but I never saw anyone. It wasn't creepy. In fact, it was beautiful, peaceful, and almost a religious experience listening to this harmonic singing. A few days later, I found myself mapping a small gorge with extremely interesting geology. As I was tapping away at some rocks, I heard the singing yet again, but this time very loudly. I was in the bottom of the gorge, and a small but active stream bubbled through and over rocks with small waterfalls along the way. Steep cliffs rose either side of me. I turned around, quite jarred by the sudden loud sound, and there she was. Halfway up the cliff, on a ledge, was the most beautiful woman dressed in blue. She had dark hair pinned up in a sort of bun, and a broad smile on her face as she looked down at me. I stood, with mouth agape, staring back at her. Who was she, and how on earth had she gotten halfway up the cliff, I asked myself. I wasn't afraid at all. In fact, I felt real peace and tranquility emanating from her. I guess the vision lasted a few minutes at most, and then the woman began to fade, along with the angelic choir singing the accompaniment. I actually spent some time looking for her just to make sure that it wasn't one of the people on the island having fun with me. I didn't find any trace of anyone. I then sat and meditated and prayed for a while, as it seemed like a real religious type experience. The next day I was sitting on the beach eating my lunch when the singing began again. It got louder and much more intense over a short period, and then it happened. Out past the rocks, an arm rose from the water holding a sword. The music and singing reached fever pitch, and it seemed as if there was just the singing, the sword, and me. To be honest, I started to giggle. I mean, it was so absurd, so Arthurian, so ridiculous I had to laugh. I also had a crack at reaching the sword, but I couldn't get there. After a few minutes, the arm disappeared with the sword beneath the waves and the singing began to fade. Again, I was left in a sort of quasi-religious state, wondering what on earth I was experiencing, and even suspecting that my lack of company was beginning to send me quite mad. Whatever the lady and the arm with the sword were, I didn't see them again, although I looked. I did hear the singing, and I heard it quite a lot, but always in the distance. If something had meant to transpire, I'd missed my opportunity. I often wonder what that was all about. Was it simply my imagination, or was there really some message for me in what I saw there on Egg? As for the shaking of the caravan along with the accompanying sound, well, in the last week of my stay on Egg, my dad joined me. I told him about this and he listened. On the first night of its stay, it happened. The noise and the vibration of the caravan as it shook and moved side to side. "See, Dad?" I said excitedly. Dad flicked on his flashlight from the bedseat opposite me and got up. I heard him open the door. I was scared for him. A minute or so later, I heard my father's laugh. "Come and look at this, will you?" he shouted to me from outside the caravan, still laughing. When I finally summoned up the courage to join him, I spotted the reason for his laughter and for my fear. A very large old cow was rubbing its back against the rope that was holding the caravan down. Looking back at those experiences on Egg, I was very fortunate to sort of forcibly experience a connection with the island, with nature itself, with the goddess. And I honestly believe that the singing and the lady that I saw were my perceptions of that connection with the land and with the goddess. I just didn't realize it at the time. The sword, well, sword is symbolic of discrimination and other things, and the sword became an important symbol for me later on. It was, in fact, how I discovered my own inner contact, using a sword in a visualization or meditation. And so perhaps the idea that the goddess was giving me a sword to discriminate with and eventually use to find my own true self, my own connection with my eternal self, with the one thing, perhaps that too was a deeply meaningful premonition of what was to take place. What I'm really trying to explain or cover in this podcast is that magic is all around you. Magic is there. Coincidences, strange happenings, sightings, hearing things, second sight. All of these things are truly human magical experiences that, if you pay attention to them, they become increasingly a part of your life and can in fact guide you through your life, take you on a path that possibly is a better path than one that you may have experienced otherwise. And I believe that from time to time, I forget my own advice and I get lost in the day-to-day physical, material side of life, my own inability to sustain a relationship and things like that, and I become miserable and I forget to see the magic. And what happened in meeting the shaman and then starting to work with the land in the Czech Republic is I re-engaged with the magical part of myself. And since we create our own reality, and since everything is one thing and the inner and the outer are only reflections of each other, why would it be surprising that I found the magic in the Czech landscape and in the Slavic hierarchy? Anyway, I hope you found this podcast interesting, and I hope you'll tune in next time when I will be talking to a very special guest about her connection with the land. But that's for another time. Thank you for joining me. My name's G. Michael Vasey. Please do visit my website, garymvasey.com, or go to my ghost paranormal story collection site, myhauntedlife2.com, or visit me on Amazon or Spotify, where you'll find my music. And once again, thank you for joining me. Until next time, enjoy the magic.
It's my life. It's my life. It's my life and I'm gonna live it.